My name is Peter Manuelian. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture, co-sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East and the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. It's great to welcome our in-person audience and also our Zoom audience. We have a special treat tonight, and our speaker gets an A for effort because she arrived after a canceled flight and with no luggage. So she deserves a little extra A for making it here on time and able to join us, jet lag or no jet lag. Dr. Yasmin El Shazly is Deputy Director for Research and Programs at the American Research Center in Egypt. She previously held the position of, ready for this, General Supervisor of the Department of International Organizations of Cultural Heritage and International Cooperation from 2016 to 2018, and Assistant to the Minister for Museum Affairs from 2015 to 16 at the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, now known as the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. She was also head of the Registration, Collections Management, and Documentation Department at the Egyptian Museum Cairo from 2009 to 16. And that was a new initiative and endeavor. So setting that up on its foundations was a tremendous achievement. And a member of the museum's board of directors from 2010 to 2013. Dr. El Shazly is currently a member of several boards, including ICOM Egypt, where she's vice chair, Interdisciplinary Egyptology, and Kitab. She's taught courses at the American University in Cairo, Cairo University, and AMIDEAST. Dr. El Shazly earned her BA from the American University in Cairo and her MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Her PhD dissertation, about which I think we'll learn something tonight, is called Royal Ancestor Worship in Deir el-Medina during the New Kingdom, and it was published by Abercromby Press in 2015. She's published several academic papers and has appeared in numerous documentaries, the last of which was PBS's Tutankhamun, Allies and Enemies, especially timely, of course, because last year was the centenary of the discovery of the tomb. Tonight, she returns to a topic on which she is clearly a world expert, the workman's village at Deir el-Medina. Please welcome, fresh off the plane from Cairo, Dr. Yasmin El Shazly.
Thank you so much, Professor Peter Manuelian, for the lovely introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to be here this evening, and I would like to start off by thanking Professor Manuelian for his kind invitation, and thanks are also due to Diana Munn and to all those who helped organize this event. It is truly an honor for me to speak here this evening about my favorite topic, Royal Ancestor Worship in Deir el-Medina. Ancient Egyptian religion is fascinating, but extremely complicated, with its multitude of deities and often contradictory mythologies. In addition to the hundreds of ancient Egyptian deities, we know that various human beings were deified throughout ancient Egyptian history. In other words, they, in a sense, managed to break the barrier between humans and the gods. A few famous examples of such figures are Imhotep, Amenhotep son of Hapu, Senefru, Nebhepet Ramentuhotep, Amenhotep I, Ahmose-Nefertari, Amenhotep III, and Ramses II. Many scholars wrote about the deification of such ancient Egyptian figures, but what did it all mean to the average person in ancient Egypt? Was a deified human being equal to the gods? Kings were all, in a sense, divine, but how divine were they compared to the gods? How much more divine did they become after their actual deification? Was there a hierarchy of divinity? How was it manifested? What kinds of powers did deified humans have over regular people? These are all questions that I will attempt to answer within the context of Deir el-Medina by demonstrating how these royal ancestors were portrayed in tomb scenes and on objects, and how they were depicted in relation to the gods and other figures. Deir el-Medina is the modern Arabic name of a settlement site located on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Luxor. It is situated in a bay in the cliff between the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramses II, and the mortuary temple of Ramses III, Medinet Habu. The village of Deir el-Medina was inhabited by the artisans and craftsmen who created and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens between the 18th dynasty and the late Ramessid period, so roughly 1550 to 1069 BC. From the 19th dynasty onwards, these workmen were known as servants in the place of truth, the place of truth being the royal necropolis. During the Christian era, the temple of Hathor, located in the village, was occupied by monks and used as a cloister. It was then referred to as Deir el-Medina, or monastery of the town, a name that was applied to the entire village. The village of Deir el-Medina not only contained the homes of the artisans and craftsmen, but also their tombs. So here you can see that these are the houses, that's the walled village. And here you have the tombs of the workmen. Many of these tombs are beautifully decorated and testify to the very high skill of their creators. The village also housed a number of temples and chapels dedicated to various deities, including deified royal figures, such as the patron gods of the village, Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari. The importance of Deir el-Medina lies in the fact that no site has yielded as much information about the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians. This was due to the extensive settlement remains, as well as the large numbers of written documents consisting mainly of ostraca, which are pottery sherds or limestone flakes bearing texts and drawings, as well as papyri that were found there. So here is a plan of Deir el-Medina. You can see here the walled village with the houses. And then you have the Western cemeteries. Here you have the main temple, the temple, Ptolemaic temple enclosure, Hathor Chapel, and here, and other chapels and temples. And here is a very important part of the settlement, the Great Pit. It's known as the Great Pit. It was actually originally dug up as a well and then turned into the village dump. So imagine someone going through your garbage today and what they can find out about you. So much stuff. They can find receipts and find out what you bought, what you normally buy. They can find out what you eat, what you drink, all sorts of things. And this pit yielded so much information about the daily lives of the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina. And most of the written documents are from that great pit. Deir el-Medina was, however, a very unique settlement, which is not representative of ancient Egyptian communities at large. It was a very closed and secluded community with an exceptionally high literacy rate and very highly skilled craftsmen. So one should be very careful when trying to draw, broad conclusions about, daily life in ancient Egypt based on that, the finds of this settlement. Ancestor worship, both royal and private, i.e. non-royal, form a very important part of the religion of the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina. Relatively common in Deir el-Medina was a type of stela dedicated to what are known as the akh-n-ra, the able spirit of Ra. It can be translated as effective or able spirit of Ra. Many of these stelae were found, well, some of them were found in domestic context because Deir el-Medina is complicated. The site has been disturbed since antiquity, and many of the finds were not found in situ. So, but there were akh-n-ra that seem to have originated in domestic contexts, along with what are known as anthropoid or ancestor busts. These busts too are believed to represent the akh-n-ra, or the able spirit of Ra. And this slide is just to show you that the akh-n-ra could also be a woman. So it wasn't something that was only, only males could be akh-n-ra. Many of these pieces were found in houses and seem to have originally been placed in niches as part of a domestic cult. So niches like these. So what is, or what was an akh-n-ra? It is believed to have been a deceased human being who is elevated to an august position through which she or he acquires special powers that enabled them to affect the lives of the living, either positively or negatively. They therefore needed to be appeased. These able spirits were relatives of the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina who had passed away, were still part of the living memory, and were believed to still have the power to interfere in the lives of the living. How this state was reached is not entirely clear. The focus of my presentation, however, is royal ancestor worship in Deir el-Medina. Deceased royal figures, especially the village's patron gods, Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari, his mother, were represented in the tombs, chapels, and homes of the inhabitants of the village. Stelae, statues, offering tables, and entire chapels within the village were dedicated to them, and their oracles were consulted in times of need and uncertainty. It was therefore believed that it was Amenhotep I who had founded Deir el-Medina. This, however, could not be proven, since it was Thutmose I's cartouches that were found stamped on the bricks of the enclosure wall of the village. Amenhotep I, however, was the first king to build his tomb separate from his mortuary temple, and he was the first king in about 400 years to build large new constructions in stone in Karnak. He was also the son of Ahmose, who was responsible for the expulsion of the Hyksos and the inauguration of the new kingdom. His mother, Ahmose-Nefertari, was probably the daughter of akh-n-ra Tao, who lost his life while expelling the Hyksos, and Ahotep, who seems to have played an active role during the war against the Hyksos. She was also probably the sister wife of Ahmose. In short, she was a king's daughter, king's wife, a king's mother, and she held the important priestly title of God's wife of Amun. Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari were not the only royal ancestors worshipped in Deir el-Medina. Other deceased royal figures were also adored by the inhabitants of the workmen's village, particularly other members of the Ahmosid line, i.e. the descendants of King Ahmose, Nebhepetram and Tuhotep, who was regarded as a dynastic founder who reunited Egypt following the first intermediate period and founded the Middle Kingdom, and even the non-royal Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the important architect, priest, and official under Amenhotep III. Other deceased New Kingdom royal figures were also depicted being worshipped in the tombs of the Theban necropolis by people who had served in their mortuary cults. The earliest evidence for the popular veneration of Amenhotep I seems to date to the reign of Hatshepsut or Thutmose III. Why and how this veneration began is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's worth noting that it was Hatshepsut who was responsible for the 18th dynasty interest in the royal ancestors, since it was during her reign, that the first great New Kingdom ancestral memorial, the family temple at Deir el-Bahri, was constructed. She was also responsible for the transformation of the Middle Kingdom, a beautiful feast of the valley, into a great annual commemoration of both royal and private ancestors, in which all the inhabitants of Thebes participated. In the Theban area, Amenhotep I appears in about 8 manifestations, 2 of which were based in Deir el-Medina. The first is Amenhotep I, Lord of the town, Pa Demi, the town being Deir el-Medina, of course. This manifestation is depicted wearing the short wig, the ibis wig, that's Lord of the town, and the boatman's circlet, and it's topped by this diadem known as the Anjeti diadem. And the second manifestation is Amenhotep Pa'u, and the first manifestation of Lord of the Town is attested from the reign of Thutmose III until the reign of Ramses XI. The second one is Amenhotep Pa'u wearing the Khepresh, or the blue crown, and seems to be restricted to the reign of Ramses II. So that's the second manifestation. The meaning of the epithet Pau is unclear, but it seems to have been translated as the interpreter or the translator. And this fits very well with the idea of Amenhotep I being an intermediary between the people and the gods, who interprets the prayers of the people to the gods. And these two manifestations are almost certainly based on cult images that were found in chapels in the village or near it. At least Pas de Mie would have been in the village. Bernard Bruyère, who excavated Deir el-Medina from 1922 to 1951, identified at least 32 cult buildings in the workmen's village, excluding the Temple of Hathor, which varied considerably in size and plan, including chapels dedicated to the accommodation of an ancestor cult, either royal or private, and chapels serving oracular purposes. Unfortunately, not much is left of these chapels. They're very badly damaged. Some elements are now completely gone. And as I said before, any objects that were found there were, everything was disturbed and not found in its original context. So it's very hard to analyze these chapels and figure out exactly what they serve. What is almost certain, however, is that some of these chapels house the cult images of these royal ancestors, and that statues of Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari were carried in procession during certain festivals, and their oracles consulted during stops made by the procession. The inhabitants of the village would approach the statues and ask a question, like, for example, would my son, if somebody had a sick child, they would ask the statue, will my child get better? And the statue would gesture somehow. How this gesture was made is not entirely clear, although I was told that there is a statue of Amun in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that actually is like a kind of a marionette where, you know, you pull something and the feathers move. So I don't know if it was something that, you know, the priests decided they will give a yes or no answer, or if it was something that was random, so that it would be like the god, it was the god's decision. A lot can be gleaned about the status of the royal ancestors within Deir el-Medina by analyzing how they were depicted in tomb scenes and on monuments and artifacts in the workmen's village. I will start off by going through some of the types of tomb scenes that can be found and what they tell us. I will only be showing examples of these scene types, otherwise we would be here all night. The first type is scenes showing royal ancestors carried in procession. And this is a line drawing because the actual scene is very badly damaged. Here we have a procession carrying a statue of Amenhotep I in his manifestation of Lord of the Town in a carrying chair. The figure of a worshiper, probably the tomb owner, which is now gone except for his feet and ankles, is represented facing the god. So here are the feet. The carrying chair is carried by priests, and the priests were actually the same as the workmen. So the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina served also as priests. Walking between the bearers is a priest holding a bundle of 3 papyrus umbels in his right hand and a hoof fan here, in his left. Any figure to which this fan is attached is designated a protected image and indicates a divine presence within the image. There are 2 other fan bearers in front of the procession. A 4th fan bearer, extending an open fan and a large bundle of plants, follows the carrying chair. This figure is identified as a priest of Djeser-Kara, or Amenhotep I, Anhotep. The figure of Amenhotep I is embraced by the damaged figure of a winged goddess standing behind him. This scene is similar to another one in which the same king, but wearing the khepresh, or in his manifestation of Pa'u, is being carried in procession. And this, in both scenes, there is a figure of Amun-Ra protected by the wings of the goddess Mat behind the image of Amenhotep I. So here's the god Amun. The statue of Amenhotep I was carried in procession on specific feast days around the village of Deir el-Medina. Scenes like this are representations of such processions. The fact that the statues of Amenhotep, the statues of Amenhotep I are unshrouded, unlike statues of gods like Amun that were hidden from the public, may have been a reflection of the accessibility of that deified king as an intermediary through whom the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina could approach the gods. In this procession scene, Amenhotep I seems to function as an intermediary to Amun-Ra, or rather a manifestation of that god. This is indicated by the fact that a small image of that god is represented behind the king's shrine. Lanny Bell states that, and I quote, Amenhotep I as an intermediary for Amun-Ra is really a form of Amun-Ra. This idea is supported by the fact that in scenes showing divine barks, the god represented standing behind the bark is the one whose cult statue is carried within the bark, end quote. That Amenhotep I is represented in both his forms of Pa-Demi and Pa'u may indicate that these two scenes were intended to show the god king as two different manifestations of two different aspects of the god Amun. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the other scene, but it's very similar of the king wearing the blue crown. The next scene type is scenes of the tomb owner offering to a royal ancestor or couple. And here, this is a scene I showed you before, showing the two different manifestations of Amenhotep I being worshipped by Kha-Bekhnet, the tomb owner, and his wife, Saht. The text above reads, offering incense to your cause by the servant in the place of truth, Kha-Bekhnet, and the lady of the house, Saht. But I won't get into this since I showed it to you before. And the next scene type is, well, let's talk a little bit about the scene type where you have the tomb owner offering to the royal ancestors or couple. Within the context of Deir el-Medina tombs, when the tomb owner is represented offering to a deceased royal figure or couple, it seems to always be the patron gods of the village. So you don't have, other kings like, Thutmose IV and his wife being adored by the tomb owner alone. So when you have just two figures, it's Amenhotep I and his mother. When analyzing these scenes, I use the principles published by Gay Robbins in her JARCI 31 article titled Some Principles of Compositional Dominance and Gender Hierarchy in Egyptian Art. So according to these principles, the left side of a scene is more important than the right. So the more important figure in the scene is on the left side, the viewer's left, the less important on the right. And the top is more important than the bottom, and the front is more important than the back. Please note that in Deir el-Medina, when you have Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari, Amenhotep I always precedes Ahmose-Nefertari. In other sites, like for example in Drab Naga, you have scenes in which Ahmose-Nefertari precedes Amenhotep I, but not in Deir el-Medina. Which means that in Deir el-Medina, Amenhotep I was more important. The next type of scene is scenes of royal ancestors offering to the gods. So in the vaulted ceiling of the second subterranean room of Theban Tomb 5, owned by Penvuyan Casa, There is a scene in which Amenhotep I is represented on the right, facing left. Note that the goddesses are on the left side, the more important side, and the king is on the right. Offering the two new pots to two goddesses on the left. The first is a cobra-headed goddess, followed by a human-headed goddess. Unfortunately, the names of these two goddesses are not provided, but the serpent-headed goddess is most likely Meret Seger, who was venerated in Deir el-Medina as goddess of the western peak, who presided over the Theban necropolis and to whom a nearby temple was dedicated. The second goddess is unfortunately almost impossible to identify, but I offer Amenhotep, the goddess of the western regions of the dead, as a possibility, whose headdress, the hieroglyphic sign for west, may have been omitted due to a lack of space. I believe she would be a logical companion to Meret Seger in such a scene. This scene is interesting in that, unlike most other depictions of Amenhotep I, in which he is shown receiving offerings, here he is the one offering to the gods. This scene is a visual demonstration of the idea that Amenhotep I functioned as an intermediary to the gods. He is shown presenting offerings on the tomb owner's behalf to two goddesses who are probably related to the necropolis and presided over the dead, if they are to be identified as Meret Seger and Amenhotep. Amenhotep, lord of the town, would thus be offering to these two goddesses so that they would facilitate the passage of the deceased to the netherworld. The burial chamber of the northern chapel of Theban Tomb 2 includes two scenes of offering to Amenhotep, one of which shows Khonsu, the tomb owner's brother, and his wife Ta-Meket standing before three seated deities, Ra, Osiris, and Amenhotep I, lord of the town. Khonsu offers a brazier with his left hand, and Ta-Meket lifts both her hands in adoration. The accompanying text reads, offering incense to your cause by the hand of the servant in the place of truth, Khonsu, true of voice, before the great God, and the lady of the house, Ta-Meket, true of voice. The names of the seated gods are written, and Amenhotep I is only identified as Amenhotep, but because of his headdress, we know which manifestation is being depicted. The deceased embraces Osiris, the deceased king embraces Osiris with his right arm. Amenhotep I is therefore here represented as equal to the gods, since he is depicted in the company of two major deities, Ra and Osiris. The fact that he is shown third in line, however, may suggest that he was considered a slightly lower rank. It is also worth noting that Amenhotep I is never referred to as Necher-Ra, or the great god, but always Necher-Nefer. So Ra and Amun and Osiris are referred to as Necher-Ra, or the great god, and Amenhotep I is always referred to as Necher-Nefer, or the good, beautiful, or perfect god, depending on how you translate it. On another scene is on the lintel at the entrance of Theban Tomb 210. Oops, why did this happen? Okay. And this is only a line drawing because the scene is also not very clear. You have two groups of deities seated upon cubical thrones, represented back to back. The first group facing left consists of Ra-Hor-Akhti, the great god, lord of heaven, Ptah-Sokar, lord of the Shetit shrine, sanctuary of Sokar, Hathor, lady of heaven, mistress of the two lands, the lord of the two lands, Amenhotep, true of voice, the god's wife, Ahmose-Nefertari, may she live, like Ray forever. That's Ahmose-Nefertari and Amenhotep I. Facing the deities on the left side, you have the tomb owner's father, the sculptor Pieg, represented along with his son Ipui, two women and two children. They are advancing towards the gods carrying offerings. And I won't get into that scene in the interest of time. The gods on the other side, I'm more concerned with the left. But the fact that you have Amenhotep I and his mother represented with the gods tells you that they are divine, but also they're at the back. They're never at the front. And then you have scenes showing sequences of royal ancestors to whom the tomb owner and often his family are shown giving offerings. This, I'll show you one of these long sequences. There are two famous ones. Here you have in Theban tomb, in the right rear wall of subterranean chamber F of Theban tomb 359, right of the entrance to the room, there is a scene in which the tomb owner, An-Kharkhawi, and his wife, Wab, are represented sensing before two rows of deified royal ancestors. The scene was badly damaged when Bruyère studied it, but fortunately a drawing by Lepsius's expedition records what had once been there. By looking at that drawing, we can see that the tomb owner wears the leopard skin of a Sem priest. He holds a long-handled censer with his left hand towards the two rows of royal figures, while his wife holds his left hand, her left hand up in adoration. The columns of text above An-Kharkhawi's head read, "Offering incense to the lords of eternity, the great ones of everlastingness, by the Osiris, the chief workman in the place of truth, belonging to the cause in the horizon of eternity, who rest therein, in Kharkhawi, through a voice with stick together." The four columns above his wife's head read, "His sister, the lady of the house, the chantress of Amun-Ra, king of the gods, Wab." For the sake of those who are not Egyptologists, sister here does not mean actual sister, it's his wife. The terms were used that way in ancient Egypt. The royal ancestors worshipped by the tomb owner and his wife are all seated upon cubical thrones. The top row contains 11 figures, four males and 7 females. The males are all mummiform and hold the crook in their left hands and the flail in their right. 2 of them wear the nemes headdress. This one and this one. One wears the ibis wig and boatman's circlet, and that's Amenhotep I. And one wears the side lock of youth. So you have Amenhotep I leading the line. And he is followed by, so Amenhotep I on the top row, he is followed by members of the Ahmosid line, the descendants of Ahmose, including Prince Ahmose-Nefertari at the end with the side lock of youth, who seems to have held a special status within the Theban necropolis. He was probably, we don't know exactly who he was, but he was probably the son of akh-n-ra Tao, who was probably heir to the throne and died prematurely, possibly. And he seems to have been venerated in the Theban necropolis. The bottom, there are stelae, but I won't show any of them tonight, dedicated to him alone. The bottom row contains 9 deified royal figures, all male, wearing the nemes, except for a prince wearing the side lock of youth and a queen who leads the row. The queen's cartouches are, cartouche is blank, but her position, as well as the fact that her skin had been painted black, indicates that she is almost certainly Ahmose-Nefertari. In Deir el-Medina tomb scenes, Ahmose-Nefertari is almost depicted with black skin, except in monochrome tombs in which the color palette is limited to yellow with outlines and details and inscriptions in black. This was not the case for contemporary depictions of her. The color black was probably used as a symbol of fertility and rejuvenation, since she was regarded as the mother of the whole dynastic line. The second figure is Ramses I, followed by Amenhotep, the king who inaugurated the Middle Kingdom. So he was regarded as a dynastic founder. Another Amenhotep, we don't know if that was Amenhotep I or who exactly, maybe another representation of him. Akh-n-ra Tao, and an unidentified male wearing the side lock of youth and sniffing a lotus flower. So that's almost certainly a prince, but we don't know what his name was. The following figure is most likely Ramses II. He is followed by a king whose cartouche was left empty. And last in line is a king whose cartouche reads Ni-Kheper-Ka-Ra, since this name does not exist. It seems like either the person who made the drawing or the ancient scribe made a mistake, and that it's probably Kheper-Ka-Ra, Thutmose I, possibly, in which the A sign was mistaken for an N. Behind Thutmose I is a figure wearing a long wig, seated on a podium with his feet tucked underneath him. He holds a palette and a brush and is identified as hereditary prince and king scribe, Hui, true of voice before the gods. And this is like the nickname of Amenhotep, son of Hapu. A temple was built for Amenhotep, son of Hapu during his lifetime, next to that of Amenhotep III on the west bank of Thebes, in close proximity to Deir el-Medina. Although smaller than the temple of Amenhotep III, that of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, is actually larger than some royal temples. It was the only private cult temple in the area, which undoubtedly made it stand out to the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina as an important monument, whose owner was special and probably even divine. He was therefore regarded as worthy of being represented in such a sequence. The temple was probably also visited during processions, during the festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley. This list seems to be partly derived from a similar scene in Theban Tomb 2A. The top row, led by Amenhotep I, here is restricted to members of the Ahmose line, while the bottom row is a mix of royal figures not abiding by any chronology, and even ending with a non-royal figure like Amenhotep, son of Hapu. And it's believed that later sequences are more less, chronological and organized than, earlier ones. So here, to the left or south of the entrance of Theban Tomb 7 of the scribe in the place of truth, Ramoses, a man is shown worshiping 4 royal ancestors. You have Amenhotep I, Ahmose-Nefertari, Horemheb, and Thutmose IV. All kings are represented mummiform, wearing the nemes and holding the crook and flail. Amenhotep I is only represented with the nemes headdress if he's within a sequence like this, but never, when he's represented with his mother alone, or alone. Ahmose-Nefertari wears the vulture headdress and modius. The text is faded, yet mostly legible, and reads, Osiris, lord of the two lands, Djeser-Ka-Ra, son of Ra, Amenhotep, the god's wife of Amun, lady of the two lands, Ahmose-Nefertari, Osiris, lord of the two lands, Djeser-Kheperu-Ra, Setepen-Ra, i.e. Horemheb, Osiris, lord of the two lands, Men-Kheperu-Ra, son of Ra, or Thutmose IV. The inclusion of Thutmose IV in this sequence can be explained by the fact that the tomb owner, Ramoses, was a scribe in the treasury of the mortuary temple of Thutmose IV before he moved to Deir el-Medina. The fact that Horemheb is included as well suggests that Ramoses may have also served in that king's mortuary cult. It is also known that Horemheb was responsible for reestablishing and expanding Deir el-Medina following the Amarna interlude, or the reign of Akhenaten, when the village was abandoned. So his status within the village was also special. So what do these scenes mean of, sequences of royal ancestors? And we have two scenes with long sequences. Lanny Bell states that, and I quote, "The king was the intermediary whereby the divine energies of the universe were made available for men. This power he derived from his ancestors, in particular from his father, who for this reason was considered as himself divine. The deceased father in his tomb was the source of power called by the Egyptians the ka, almost the spirit of kingship. Or the soul of kingship. Scenes showing the tomb owner, sometimes accompanied by members of his family, offering to or adoring a sequence of royal ancestors, were probably meant to be visual representations of the worship of this divine power, namely the royal ka, the source of which was the royal ancestors, which was passed on through different generations of royal figures. In long sequences, the choice of royal ancestors represented was usually based on the Ahmose line, led by the village's patron gods Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari, along with dynastic founders such as Amenhotep I and other figures whose mortuary temples were visited during important festivals such as the beautiful Feast of the Valley. Shorter sequences included kings in whose cult the tomb owner had served. So kings that had with whom the tomb owner had a special relationship. In these sequences, you never have the living king. It's always deceased kings. Now I'll go into royal ancestors represented on objects from Deir el-Medina. This is a black and white photo of bank stela number 12 from Deir el-Medina, dating to the reign of Ramses III and owned by the Wab priest or purification priest of Ahmose-Nefertari, Tol. On this stela, Ahmose-Nefertari is depicted playing sistra before Amun-Ra. A vertical column of inscription behind Ahmose-Nefertari reads, "Made by the Wab priest of the Lady of the Two Lands," in reference to Ahmose-Nefertari. Tol, or Jai, true of voice, son of the scribe Amennacht, true of voice. A short horizontal line at the bottom reads, "Made by the scribe of the house of eternity, Pentaweret," his brother, true of voice. Ahmose-Nefertari is represented on this monument as an intermediary between the owner or the dedicator of the stela and the god Amun, so that he would act favorably towards them. As the god's wife of Amun, Ahmose-Nefertari could intercede on behalf of the god Amun, and the owner of the stela, Tol, or Jai, was himself a priest in the cult of Ahmose-Nefertari, so having her intercede on his behalf made a lot of sense. And here you have a stela on which you have Amenhotep I leaning forward and adoring Amun, the god Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the Theban triad. The accompanying inscription reads, "Giving praise to your Ka, Amun-Ra, Lord of the beautiful encounter, kissing the earth for your name by the hand of the Wa priest of the Lord of the Two Lands in the place of truth, Pamedu-Necher Nacht, true of voice, son of the servant in the place of truth on the west of Waset, High, true of voice, by the hand of his beloved son, Amenhotep Nefer and Waset, true of voice." So you have Amenhotep I offering on behalf of the Wa priest of the Lord of the Two Lands, the dedicator of the stela, And the stela was supposedly dedicated actually by Amenhotep's son, Amenhotep Nefer and Waset, through a voice in honor of his father. Note that Amenhotep had probably named his son after Amenhotep I, the deified king in whose cult he had served. And this one is you have the deceased offering to the royal ancestors. So you have here, this one is an interesting stela. You have, but also pretty complicated. And here it dates to the 19th dynasty. And on the stela, you have a woman named Heriya, represented offering to Ahmose-Nefertari. Note that this name is poorly attested in Deir el-Medina, but not non-existent. A woman named E is depicted kneeling with her hands raised in adoration in the bottom right. And the text reads, praying to Ahmose-Nefertari, mistress of the town, she causes that I see darkness that I have created. Enlighten my eyes, be merciful to me, be merciful. For the ka of the mistress of the house, E, true of voice. In the inscription, Heriya asks Ahmose-Nefertari to enlighten her eyes, in the sense of giving her back her eyesight. However, it is interesting that Heriya's name is qualified with the epithet Ma'khiru, true of voice, which is supposed to be associated with deceased individuals, but not always. It's sometimes used as in an anticipatory sense. So was this figurative blindness? Because there is an idea that blindness wasn't necessarily, when it was referred to in such monuments, it wasn't necessarily a real kind of blindness, but a figurative one, that someone had committed a sin and wanted to be forgiven. The fact that the exact identities of these two women cannot be determined makes it impossible for us to figure out the relationship between them. However, it is worth noting that Heriya is mentioned in year 6 of Seti II on Ostrakhan Nash 1, which records the case of a woman accused and convicted of stealing a workman's spike. Was this the same Heriya? We don't know. Stelae showing the deceased offering to royal ancestors were dedicated by holders of titles as high as vizier, processional leader, deputy relief sculptor, servant in the place of truth, and lady of the house. So everybody had access to the royal ancestors. And here you have a stela from the chapel of Theban Tomb 290, owned by the servant in the place of truth, Eri Nefer. So here you have, again, Osiris and Anubis. This was in the tomb, so it's the context is clearly funerary, and you have Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, and Anubis, god of mummification, on the more prestigious left side. And then you have on the right, Amenhotep I and his mother, Ahmose-Nefertari. And then the tomb owner and his family on the bottom registers. So this again shows that Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari were divine, not as divine as the figures on the left. You also have stelae showing the reigning king offering to the royal ancestors. So here, this stela belonged to a vizier. We don't have the name is broken. And you have here represented Seti I offering to Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari. And this was a stela owned by a vizier. Unfortunately, we don't have the bottom part of the stela. So we don't know what the inscription said, but it seems, we don't have enough examples, but it seems like to have the king represented offering on your behalf to the royal ancestors was something that only important people could have represented in their monuments or stelae. And then you have the deceased offering directly to the gods. And that again was something that important people could do. So here you have, this is interesting because you have Amun, Mut, and Amenhotep III. So here it's like Amenhotep III here is playing the role of Khonsu. So he's completing the Theban triad. So instead of, normally you would have Amun, Mut, and their son Khonsu, but here instead of Khonsu, you have Amenhotep I. There are so many other scenes that I didn't show, but other than stelae, and you also have offering tables like this one, dedicated to Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari. And this was probably from Chapel D that seems to have been dedicated to the cult of Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari. And this is a votive statue of Ahmose-Nefertari, and many were found in Deir el-Medina. This was also probably from Chapel D, as well as this statue of Ramses II, of Amenhotep I, dating to the reign of Ramses II. So long after Amenhotep I had died. This again was probably from Chapel D, but we cannot be sure because again, the site was disturbed. So evidence for the veneration of Amenhotep, of the royal ancestors, continues in Deir el-Medina until the end of the Ramesside period, when it is manifested on a very interesting object, the outer coffin of the scribe of the necropolis, Tutankhamun, son of the scribe of the necropolis, Tutmosis II. This piece was found in Deir el-Medina in Theban tomb 291, tomb of Nachmen. And what's very interesting, you have a winged goddess, and then under the wings, you have these two registers. You have, it's the area is divided into panels, and you have two registers. The first two registers of the scenes, right of center, represent images of members of the Ahmosid line. The first shows Amenhotep I, and then you have his grandmother, Ahotep, and then Ahmose-Nefertari. Tutankhamun is shown with his head shaven, standing before them holding a censer in his right hand and a libation vessel in his left. In the scene below, Tutankhamun stands before two more female royal figures, identified as Sitamun, so maybe daughter of Ahmose and Ahmose-Nefertari, and Meret Amun, who's the sister wife of Amenhotep I, but is always she's not shown with Amenhotep I in Deir el-Medina as his consort next to him. It's always his mother. You never find her sitting next to Amenhotep I. And they are followed by a male figure wearing a long wig whose face had been painted black and is identified as the king's son, Sapair. So Ahmose-Sapair, the prince who had this special cult in the Theban necropolis. The importance of this coffin lies in the fact that it seems to date to the final years of the workmen's community at Deir el-Medina, and therefore indicates that the cult of Amenhotep I and his family was still flourishing then. On the inside of the coffin lid, the beginning of the scribe's opening of the mouth text seems to refer to a ceremony performed for Osiris King Amenhotep. And this text is subject to debate, but Nivinsky, for instance, argues that it implies that Tutankhamun played an important role in the renewal of Amenhotep's burial. But it's not that only that, because he also renewed the burial of Ramses III, but you don't find him on the coffin. So clearly, these figures still had a special status at that time. And we know that there were letters that were found, Thutmose's, Tutankhamun's father. In these letters, he showed his devotion to Amenhotep I and Ahmose-Nefertari, who were mentioned, like asking them to protect the person he was sending the letters to. So wait. So this is a line drawing that gives you more, shows you more details. There is evidence for the cult of Amenhotep I as late as the Ptolemaic period. It is interesting that representations of Amenhotep I are particularly common on 21st and 22nd dynasty coffins. In the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East is the very interesting cartonnage case of Padimut. During the 22nd dynasty, dating to the 22nd dynasty, on which Amenhotep I is depicted 3 times. Susan Hollis comments that the case is also distinctive because of the complete absence of any depictions of the god Osiris on it. The first representation of Amenhotep I appears on the right shoulder. The deceased census before Amenhotep I, who is depicted seated on a throne wearing the ibis wig and boatman's circlet, surmounted by the Anjeti diadem, like Amenhotep, lord of the town. He is depicted mummiform, holding the crook and flail against his chest. The accompanying inscription reads, "Lord of the 2 lands, Jeser Kara, may he grant peace to the Wab priest of Amun, Padimut, true of voice." He is also depicted on the back and on the footboard. It seems that Amenhotep I is playing almost like the role of Osiris on this cartonnage case. How the cult of Amenhotep I and other New Kingdom royal ancestors evolved through the ages and why is still something scholars, including myself, are exploring. But what one needs to understand is that to the ancient Egyptian, they were saints with whom they had a special connection. They felt that they could intercede on their behalf, both in this life and the next. They were divine, but their status was considered lower than that of the great gods. Everybody had access to them. They were both loved and feared, and they constantly needed to be appeased. The inhabitants of Deir el-Medina gave them offerings, participated in festivals celebrating them, during which they consulted their oracles, and even had them depicted on their tomb walls and coffins after their death, so that they could intercede on their behalf in the netherworld. They were divine, but they were also close and familiar. Thank you for your attention.